Welcome to Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. This is the 21st video in this series. Today I'll talk about what I call the woke assault on normativity. From extreme postmodernism to queer theory to post-colonialism to disability studies, we're told that social expectations about so-called normal ways of being, thinking, and behaving are oppressive. In service to personal freedom and social justice, we should see norms as social constructions that are used by dominant groups to privilege themselves and oppress groups deemed to be abnormal. Instead, we should embrace all ways of being and behaving as equal in value and acceptability, and transcend notions of normativity altogether. Is this wise or even possible? That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Hello, my name's Michael Dewan-Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with over 40 years of experience. In recent years, I've become increasingly concerned about the impact of critical social justice theory on the training of psychotherapists and the practice of psychotherapy. Since July of this year, I've been posting videos to speak out about it. But let's get back to the topic and jump right in. Let's start with the basics, a definition of norms and a description of their purpose. Norms are established rules or standards of behavior, belief, and attitudes within a society or in a social group. They tell us what is considered acceptable, appropriate, or expected behavior within a context, within any given context. Norms serve various purposes. They provide social order, facilitate communication, and guide individual and group behavior. They can be explicit or implicit, influencing social structures and individual actions. Norms create a consensus reality that facilitates group cohesion and cooperation, without which groups fall into conflict and chaos. Individual human survival depends on the social matrix, so having norms turns out to be necessary for survival. Let that sink in for a moment. Norms can evolve and change over time, and some are more flexible and less rigidly enforced than others. Nevertheless, the absence of any norms would make it impossible to establish social order, communication, or shared understanding among group members. So how are norms created and maintained? Most usually they're established by groups and cultures in an organic way and passed on from generation to generation through socialization, but they can also be newly created by consensual agreement or by the imposition of some authority. Either way, they are communicated and taught as expectations for behavior and ways of thinking. Violation of norms is discouraged, and usually there's some social cost or sanction involved to encourage a return to conformity. So the first point I want to make and emphasize about norms is that every culture has them. They're necessary for establishing and maintaining a sense of group cohesion and cooperation. Without them, no social group would survive for long as a group. Without norms, there is chaos and conflict, ultimately leading to the dissolution of the group. And now my second point, which always rides in tandem with the first point. As soon as we decide what is considered normal, we will automatically also decide what is abnormal. Those unwilling or unable to conform to norms will be considered abnormal or deviant. This can lead to stigmatization, prejudicial treatment, and marginalization. The social cost of violating cultural norms can be seen and experienced as a form of oppression, a constriction of individual freedom. Whether by explicit social sanction or informal exclusion, the individual who violates norms will pay a price. This leads to my third point. While norms are established to serve the collective, and concern about oppression places value on individual freedom and inclusivity, the collective and the individual are intrinsically married, in tension with each other. There is no collective without individuals, and no individual survives long apart from the collective. The collective imposes responsibilities, obligations, and limitations on the individual, and the individual demands rights, freedom, and inclusion. This is a dilemma baked into the human condition. My proposition is that in order to have a cohesive and cooperative social order and so survive, we need to have norms. However, because of the potential for norms to be oppressive, we need to have a respectful, flexible, and compassionate way to relate to those who do not or cannot conform to them. In fact, we need people who do not conform so that our norms can evolve over time and allow us to adapt to changing conditions. I suggest we consider norms from the following perspective. Our evolution as a species, beyond our physical evolution, has involved our invention of culture and its norms in order to contend with and navigate the challenges of survival and reproduction. Certain things needed to be done, and we had to come up with effective ways to do those things. This involved the creation of roles. Who should assume which roles, how they should best be accomplished, and how we should work together toward the same ends. Although the necessity of norms can and has been seized upon by those mostly motivated by the acquisition of personal power, that is not the primary reason that norms were established. Norms are not fundamentally an arbitrary construct serving no other purpose but the oppression of one group by another. They're collective agreements about how to best work together toward the end of survival and reproduction. By contrast, how does woke generally understand and relate to norms? Through the lenses of extreme postmodernism and critical theory, which includes queer theory, postcolonialism, and disability studies, which includes the idea of neurodiversity, to name a few, norms are seen as antagonistic to individual freedom and social justice. This is because, as mentioned, it automatically establishes what is normal or even pathological. Individuals and groups that fall outside of normal are then oppressed, according to woke, by a dominant normal group. Queer theory, in particular, is explicit in its agenda to deconstruct all norms, revealing them as mere exercises in oppressive power by dominant groups. To subscribe to queer theory is to unsubscribe to any and all norms and live in nonconformity. While there are endless norms that can be part of the social glue for different groups, woke tends to focus on a handful of categories, such as sex, gender, sexuality, neurodiversity, and race. I include race here as it seems that any norms that have been historically associated with white cultures, no matter how diverse and heterogeneous those are now considered instances of white supremacy and therefore oppressive. So let's start with sex. All cultures have had a simple norm for determining who is male and who is female. This has to do with human sexually dimorphic anatomy and the biological roles of males and females in reproduction. Once an individual's sex is determined, all cultures also have had norms for governing male and female roles. It's true that some cultures have been more flexible about gender expression, even if they never heard that term, but at the same time, an individual's sex has not been in question until recently. And there have still generally been norms for male and female roles, even in more flexible cultures. By and large, this is what gave rise to what we call patriarchy in every culture. although some would argue there have been exceptions. Patriarchy, I would argue, is not a male power play meant to subjugate and oppress women and give advantage to men. Most cultures have discovered that it optimizes survival and reproduction if men and women take different roles and work together for a common cause. For instance, the creation of viable offspring. These roles confer responsibilities and obligations and constrain individual freedoms of both sexes. Now on to gender. Prior to the latter half of the 20th century, the norm was to consider sex and gender as synonymous. Now we think of them as separate, which is a new norm that we're still trying to understand and adjust to. Part of the thinking in separating them has been the idea that gender is a social construct. Implicit in that designation is that it's rather arbitrary and primarily serves the patriarchy. From a feminist perspective, the roles that culture had assigned to the genders was for the purpose of subjugating and oppressing women and giving men all of the power and advantages. Feminism seeks to challenge and overturn that oppressive system, smash the patriarchy. More recently, sex and gender are not only seen as separate, but gender is fluid and non-binary and conflated with sex. Men can be women and women can be men, or you can be neither, or you can change depending on how you feel on any particular day. This is based on the subjective feeling of an individual, that they identify with the gender opposite to their sexual anatomy, and the roles and norms typically assigned to that assigned gender. And what about sexuality? Just as even flexible cultures still have norms for each gender, all cultures, even when flexible, have also had norms about sexuality being primarily a heterosexual arrangement. It seems that life, generally, has the drive to reproduce itself. Toward that end, cultures have developed to harness and facilitate this primal instinct. So it makes sense that heteronormativity would become a thing, even in cultures where homosexuality is accepted or even celebrated. Queer theory began as a challenge to the oppressive nature of sexual and gender norms, starting with cis heteronormativity. It considers all such norms as the perpetration of oppression by dominant groups and sought the abolition of these norms. Beyond this, it now also seeks to deconstruct and argue against any and all norms. Cultures with rigid norms around heterosexuality often frame their position with the moral authority of a received religious doctrine. My view is that these are ossified relics of a time when cultures were simply attempting to strictly abide by the parameters given to human beings by nature. They need not apply so rigidly at this point in time. At the same time, nature is still nature, and a society composed only of homosexuals will not survive. The same cannot be said of a society composed only of heterosexuals. This is simply a fact. This suggests there is still some place for cultures to have norms about heterosexuality, even if quite flexible. And even cisgendered heterosexuals have had to contend with norms around sexuality, well, up until the sexual revolution of the 60s anyway. All of those old moralistic codes about virginity until marriage, monogamy, limiting one's sexual partners, having a family, and so on, were seen as outdated prescriptions meant only to oppress individual sexual freedom. They were all arbitrary and served no real purpose except to force compliance with the patriarchy. Is it just maybe possible that most cultures have understood that for offspring to be viable, they require a stable family structure to grow up in, and that unlimited sexual freedom is not the best way to accomplish this? obedience to religious doctrine with moral prescriptions around sex may not be the only or even the primary reason for such norms. I certainly am not arguing or making an argument for returning to a more rigid set of sexual norms. Personally, I would rather live in a more flexible society. At the same time, I appreciate the reason for and the value of some sexual norms, again, in service to reproducing viable human life. Now a few words about neurodiversity. This is a big topic that deserves a fuller exploration, perhaps in another video, but I want to offer a few basic thoughts about it here. The idea behind neurodiversity is that neurological differences such as ADHD, dyslexia, and autism are natural variations of the human brain and shouldn't be pathologized as disorders. This idea has even been extended to traditional psychiatric diagnoses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder. As well, in some circles, it includes depression and anxiety and mood disorders. From this point of view, the diagnosis and treatment of these things as pathologies is part of the normative culture's oppression of the so-called abnormal. Michel Foucault wrote extensively about this in his book Madness and Civilization, as did Thomas Szasz in his book The Manufacture of Madness. Following these authors, in the latter part of the 20th century, we saw the development of the social model of disability. In this view, a disability, whether physical or psychological, is not simply the malfunction of an individual, but rather it's a product of how the society around them does not accommodate their needs. Personally, I think this was a profoundly important contribution to an understanding of disability, one that pointed in new directions for how to support and accommodate differently abled people so that they can participate as much as possible in all things. However, by asserting that all neurological and psychological differences are equal, no matter how divergent they are from standards for what is considered functional, healthy, and normal, I think we fail to recognize that some things are genuine problems, all by themselves. Schizophrenia is not an equally valid take on reality. Borderline personality traits are not equally up to the demands of interpersonal relationships. Bipolar mood swings are a terrifying roller coaster ride that can leave a person unable to keep themselves safe or manage the tasks of daily living. I say this not from a theoretical point of view. I've seen it all up very close and in detail. While the right social environment is necessary to support someone's recovery from these conditions, the point is that they need to recover. They don't need to be validated and supported as having equally valid interpretations of reality and strategies for living and accommodated regardless of their behavior. They don't need to be told that they are perfectly fine if we could only change the world so that it would quit judging and oppressing them. We definitely need to work on developing more compassionate treatment options. But this won't happen by locating the problem solely within an oppressive society. And finally, a few words about race and normality. Clearly, from our current moral perspective, predominantly white Western nations and cultures have a nasty history of enslavement, colonization, and oppression of minority groups, just like nearly every other human group throughout history and prehistory. It is right that this be recognized and that any vestiges of it still remaining, of those evils, be identified and rooted out. At the same time, as I pointed out at the beginning of this video, every culture establishes its norms to facilitate social cohesion and cooperation. So-called white culture is no different. The problem, as I see it, is that critical theory, through its various branches, attacks every white norm, from scientific methodologies to hard work, meritocracy, punctuality, delayed gratification, and so on. It does not seem to recognize that norms are necessary and that they intrinsically come with expectations and constraints on individual freedoms. The very audacity of white people to have norms is condemned as supremacist oppression of other cultures' norms. There's no acknowledgement that other cultures' norms also come with their own limits on individual freedoms. Oftentimes, even more rigid norms and more severe sanctions for noncompliance. This is the challenge of multicultural societies. For the norms of different cultures to be included within a single unified group, there must be some shared values, norms, and overarching principles that all people are willing to subscribe to. That's what a liberal democracy provides. The associated norms for this include universal human rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and representative government. The initial movement toward liberal democracy came out of the European Enlightenment. In other words, white people, white men. Others came along later, like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King Jr., to insist that the principles of liberal democracy be more inclusively realized. They meant to advocate further for these principles, not undermine them. My point is that white people are not just devils. They've contributed significantly to the very possibility of diversity, equality, and inclusion. To focus only on what is morally repugnant about white history and what is yet imperfect, and take this view as a justification for dismantling everything white, a rejection of every value or norm that can be attributed to whiteness, is a mistake. It's the kind of thinking that, if followed to its logical conclusion, winds up in tribal warfare and ultimately genocide. Every genocide has justified itself in just these terms. It is a racist project to the core. A liberal democracy ideally is flexible and makes room for those who don't conform to all norms. It is open to norms changing over time. It aspires to uphold the dignity and respect of all people and treat them equally under the law, even if they don't follow the norms, as well to change laws when they are deemed unjust. If the woke movement, or the radical left, is ultimately successful in its critical dissection and dismantling of everything white and the refutation of all norms as oppressive, what will they create instead? Utopia? What will that look like? A glorious free-for-all? Some kind of spontaneous and natural harmony and cooperation between people who no longer compete with each other for resources and need no external compulsions to behave that way? I think not. Far-left libertarianism is a naive fantasy. Those who start down that path discover that their utopia can only be established with brute authoritarian force. Re-enter norms, this time enforced with brutal force and punishment. The woke ultimately become a worse version of everything they claim to be fighting against. Beyond its corrosive impact on our culture, or even before that, none of this is good for mental health. Literally, just yesterday, I was in a session with a client who was crying and saying, "I just want to be normal." Her difficulties in relationships and her struggles to regulate her emotions have been painful and exhausting. She doesn't just long to conform to social expectations or see her pain as a result of social judgment and pressure. I've worked with people with every major psychiatric disorder, and their pain and suffering is real. I have seen how treatment can be inhumane and oppressive. I've worked in psychiatric hospitals for 8 years. I've also seen how it can be truly compassionate and facilitate recovery. While challenging inhumane and profiteering treatment is a noble cause, normalizing or even glorifying mental illness and blaming all suffering due to it on an oppressive society is not helpful. I want to close with one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell. He says, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." In simplified terms, when it comes to norms and the constraints that they impose on personal freedom, there are two kinds of solutions that are typically presented. Those concerned with the well-being of the collective offer that there should be strict norms and severe consequences for nonconformity. Those most concerned with individual freedom propose an end to norms and all measures to enforce them. These solutions are the product of reductionism, either to the values of the collective or the individual. Each set of solutions, by its omission of the values of the other, leads to catastrophic outcomes sooner or later. We're stuck with a tension between the need for norms and the need for individual freedom and inclusion. It's an eternal dilemma that we can best approach with the understanding that honoring both the collective and the individual will require trade-offs. Also, that the nature of these trade-offs will evolve over time as we adapt to changing conditions. And this will be best accomplished if we recognize our own reductionistic tendencies and visions, ideal visions and solutions to stop demonizing those who come from the other side. To do this requires civil discourse and dialogue. In that sense, this fundamental polarity between the collective and the individual, rather than being seen as a curse, can be seen as a dynamic tension and utilized for producing new and creative ways for moving forward together. That's it for now. If you like this video, please don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to my channel, click the bell for notifications, leave me a comment, and share it with a friend. If you do any of these things, I'll be greatly appreciative. It helps my channel to grow. I hope you'll join me for my next video. Until then, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.